Hello again! Earlier in the series, we discussed how it's important to always record a dry version of every performance, and I showed you how to record that dry track using a DI box. Now in this video, I'm going to show you how we can use that dry track to elevate our guitar tones after the guitar session is over, and we're going to do so using a technique called reamping. So what exactly is reamping and what do we need? Well, reamping is we're going to take that dry signal that we recorded and we're going to send it back out of our DAW, out of our computer, into another amplifier or into a series of pedals, whatever we want, and then we're going to record that affected signal back into our interface, back into our computer. And this gives us quite a few advantages. The most obvious one, of course, is being able to run it through as many amps as you want and panning them around, maybe one left, one right, or really you could have a bunch of different amps all around the stereo field. But an often overlooked benefit is it's so much easier to edit dry guitar rather than guitar you recorded through an amp. And you can see this just by looking at the waveforms here. So reamping is extremely helpful, but what do we need in order to accomplish it? We're going to need an audio interface with at least 4 outputs, and we're going to need a reamp box. And then of course you're going to need something to reamp into, be it an amp or some pedals. Now the reamp box that I love is the Radial Engineering EXTC, but there really are tons of them out on the market, so check which one works best for you. Some of the things you want to check for before you purchase: you need to be able to change the send and receive levels, as well as invert the phase if you need to. Having a blend knob can be extremely helpful as well, especially when reamping just to guitar pedals. Being able to blend the wet and the dry helps a lot in those situations. Next, I'm going to pop over to Pro Tools, which is my DAW of choice, but most of the things we're going to talk about here do carry over to every DAW on the market. So far I've created my track, set my inputs and outputs, and I've set my level like we talked about in the previous videos. So really quick, let's just record a little bit on the second verse of this song, and then we can start reamping.
Playing all of my dreams is keeping me up all night. And when the question comes if it will work out, the answer is that it might or it might not. Living in all of these moments, it's gonna...
Cool, and I think that's close enough for now. Timing wasn't perfect, but as I mentioned, it's very easy to edit those things later. So for now, let's go ahead and get reamping. So here's our dry signal just soloed. And that's about the opposite of exciting. So let's go ahead and send this out to our reamp box and then into that bass breaker tube amp that we've been using. And there's a few ways we can do this depending on the capabilities of your DAW. If the DAW you're using allows you to set up hardware inserts, then I'd suggest setting your reamp box up as an insert. But if not, then you're going to need to set it up as a send. So first, let's go ahead and set this up as an insert. We're just going to select the slot we want to insert this on and go to I/O, and then you'll select whichever insert corresponds with the output that you have your reamp box plugged into. Then it's always a good idea to rename this so you don't have to remember it all in your head. You can just read that this is your reamp box. Now, as far as DAW setup is concerned, that's all we need to do to set up reamping as an insert, which is why I really like doing it this way. It keeps it very simple. We're just inserting the reamp box into the signal flow that already exists in our DAW. So let's switch gears really quick and talk about how we set it up in the hardware world. We're going to need to take a balanced TRS cable and we're going to connect it to the output of our interface into the balanced input of our reamp box. Then we're going to take a regular guitar cable, which is an unbalanced TS cable, and we're going to use this to connect the send of either loop A or loop B into whatever we're reamping through, in this case the guitar amp. Then you're going to mic your guitar amp. In this case, to keep it simple, I'm just going to use a single SM57, but feel free to use any of the techniques we've talked about in this series. Then we're going to plug that microphone into the same input that corresponds with the output we're using for our insert. Now, in some DAWs, you don't have to do this. You can set it manually, but in Pro Tools, it does have to be the corresponding input. Now, if you're just using pedals and not an amp that you can actually mic, that's when you need a reamp box that actually has a receive or a return end, and then you'll take the output of your reamp box back into your interface as a line level signal. The next step is we're going to send that dry signal out and do a little tweaking on the amp to make sure we're getting the tone that we want. And of course, guitar tone is subjective, but I'm going to go with that for this example. You can of course spend as much time or as little time as you want. And then when you're ready to bake in the sound into a new track, it's very simple. All we need to do is right click our track. We're going to go to commit, where we can decide what we want to do with this dry track when we're done. And then we can hit OK. And of course, since this is hardware, we cannot use the offline feature. This is going to bounce it in real time through the amp and record it back onto a new track for us.
Playing all of my dreams is keeping me up all night. And when the question comes if it will work out, the answer is that it might or it might not. Living in all of these moments is gonna.
And just like that, we have a new track with our reamped sound baked in. So of course, rename it. I'm just going to call it Guitar Reamp, but you can name it the name of the microphone, whatever your system is. And one more quick thing before we move on. This is a really cool tip. If your reamping is an insert, you can add whatever plugins or filters, compression, EQ, whatever you want to do before the insert that sends it out to the amp. And it's just like having those as an effects pedal before your amp. It's affecting the dry signal and then being sent out. So it really gives you millions of different options here without having to buy new hardware for each of those things. And of course, anything you insert after the reamp insert will of course be applied after the fact as well. Now let's go ahead and set this up as a send. We'll go ahead and take this reamp insert off completely, and then we're going to go to our sends and send it out our output number 5 because that's where we have our reamp box connected. Again, we're going to want to rename this reamp. But this is where we start to see some differences. With a send, you can send any amount of the signal out that you'd like. Now, this isn't ideal, but here's a tip. If you don't have a reamp box and you still want to reamp, sometimes you can get an okay tone by just sending less of the signal out to an amp. Of course, you don't want to send a full line level signal out, so lowering it does help, but I want to stress that it's not the same impedance-wise. That's why the reamp box really will get you better results every time. But if you're in a pinch, this does usually help. So since we are using a reamp box, we can go ahead and bring this back up to 0 because we can send our full line level strength out to the reamp box to be converted to high impedance so your guitar gear likes it. Now, the next thing is in most DAWs, you can switch between sending it pre or post fader. And in most cases, I recommend sending pre-fader. That way you can change the fader in your DAW or mute the track however you need to do for monitoring without affecting what you're sending out to the amp or pedals or whatever you're reamping with. So we're ready to go, and just for fun, I'm going to go ahead and plug in another mic just to show that we can, and I'll bring a Sennheiser MD421 into the equation, but again, anything you want to do works here. Now, in this method, we actually do need to record our signal onto 2 new tracks, so you'll need to create 2 tracks, name them, record arm them. You can pan them left and right if you want. Set your levels, do everything that way, and then you're ready to record.
Playing all of my dreams is keeping me up all night. And when the question comes if it will work out, the answer is that it might or it might not. Living in all of these moments is gonna.
And this is why I love reamping. That quickly we have 2 microphones recorded from the same dry track performance. And I'm trying to keep it really simple here, but the idea is you could send those out to different amps, and you could send them out 15 different times if you wanted to, because it's the same performance being sent every time. And remember, we started with only this. It goes without saying, reamping gives you a ton of flexibility. So that's everything for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned a ton about reamping and at least now have a base knowledge of everything necessary to get creative with your guitar tones even after the recording session has ended. In the next video, we're going to talk about some post-production techniques that bring these raw recorded tracks into a polished state that's ready to be mixed and mastered. So rock on, everybody. I'll see you in the next one.